Welcome to Latinx Art and American Past and Futures. I'm E. Carmen Ramos, Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer at the National Gallery of Art. On behalf of the Henry Luce Foundation and our hosts at the New York Historical Society, I welcome you to the Conversations on American Art and Museums, a celebration of the Luce American Art Program's 40th anniversary. Since its founding in 1982, the American Art Program has provided support totaling $250 million to 500 museums across all 50 states. It continues to award approximately $7.5 million annually for innovative museum projects in the visual arts in an open and equitable society. Through this work, the Luce seeks to advance the role of visual arts in an open and equitable society and the potential for museums to serve as public forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and seek common ground. With an eye towards the future and the best possible art for art museums, these conversations will explore the capacity of art museums to challenge accepted histories and advance the dialogues in which we need to engage with diverse collaborators and communities. I'm delighted to moderate a discussion with other curatorial leaders about the increasing presence of Latinx art in American art museums today. Together, we will consider how three institutions are navigating a pivot point in the framing of national culture and a recalibration of understandings of U.S. art and history. While Latinx art has been part of the cultural production of what is now the United States for centuries, it is only in the past few decades that it has garnered greater visibility. I describe the current moment as a pivot point because of the increasing momentum across many fields to affirm and explore the inextricable place of Latinx art in the art world and American art history and museums in particular. Several milestones come to mind that mark this greater presence. The increasing support for scholarship with important initiatives like the AVER Revisiting Art History series, spearheaded by UCLA's Chicano Research Studies Center. The production of major exhibitions of Latinx art at institutions like the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, the Whitney, LACMA, and exhibition initiatives like the two iterations of Pacific Standard Time supported by the Getty. In addition to the endurance of important exhibition series like El Museo's historic biennial, now triennial, which first launched in the 1990s and continues to give many Latinx artists their first entree into the field. The launching of the Smithsonian's Latino Curatorial Initiative in 2010 was instrumental. This program embedded numerous Latinx experts in positions across the Smithsonian who have transformed the collections, exhibitions, programs, and initiatives at the world's largest museum complex. This was followed by the hiring of curators with Latinx expertise at institutions like the Whitney Museum of American Art, and most recently, the Blanton Museum, and several others to follow, thanks to transformative funding from the Mellon, Ford, Getty, and Terra Foundations. And of course, the launching of the Latinx Artist Fellowship, supported by Mellon and Ford Foundations, that provides critical funding to leading Latinx artists of our day. And lastly, the adoption of more inclusive language that has activated the field in energizing ways. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our two panelists who will help us explore how American art museums are navigating the current moment and help us imagine what the future might hold. I'm pleased to welcome Rodrigo Maura, a writer, editor, and curator born in Brazil and living in New York, where since 2019, he is the chief curator at El Museo del Barrio. In this role, Rodrigo established a dynamic exhibition program for El Museo, focusing on the institution's foundational ethos and on the contributions of Latinx artists to the development of art in the United States in the past 50 years. This program included the new series Latinal, a vibrant showcase of contemporary art, and the critically acclaimed Rafael Montañez Ortiz, a contextual retrospective presented at El Museo del Barrio and Museo Tamayo in 2022 and 2023. Before working at El Museo, he was a curator and artistic director of Instituto Inhotim, and after that, as the first adjunct curator of Brazilian art at the Museo de Arte de Sao Paulo, where he organized solo presentations of Alejandrino, Candido Portinari, Melvin Edwards, and Teresina Soares, among others. We are also joined by Marcela Guerrero, the DeMartini family curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She is the curator of No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán, Puerto Rican art in the wake of Hurricane Maria, and Martín Gutiérrez, Supremacy, both currently on view at the Whitney. From 2014 to 2017, she worked as a curatorial fellow at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Prior to joining the Hammer, she worked in the Latin American and Latino art department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Guerrero holds a PhD in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for having us. It's a true honor.
Yeah, it's great to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
So each of us comes from very different types of institutions, each with a different history and relationship to Latinx art. So Rodrigo, of course, you come from a historic Latinx museum founded during the Civil Rights era by Puerto Rican and New Rican activists and artists. Marcela, you're affiliated with one of the most important museums of US American art. And I'm with the Nations Museum, known for its stellar collections of works by European and American artists from the old master era to today. I'd really love if you can both just share with us and share with our audiences how each of your institutions began its journey with Latinx art. So Marcela, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, yeah. I guess as a, not to give too long of a story, but just to provide a bit of context of when the Whitney was founded in 1930 by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was back then one of the preeminent collectors of American art, of US American art. And she had this incredible collection that, in fact, she offered to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was declined. So she went ahead and founded her own museum in 1930. And it opened its doors in 1931. Prior to that, she had been exhibiting in her Whitney club. What was it called? The Whitney Studio Club. And she had exhibited artists like Orozco, Covarrubias, artists, Mexican artists who had been in New York for a long period of stay in New York or in the US in general. But the Whitney's journey, I guess, into Latinx art didn't really start until 1963, when the museum acquired its first work by Marisol in 64, and that was a gift, a lithograph. In 64, we purchased Women and Dog, which is an iconic work. And then that was followed in 1965, we acquired a work by Rafael Montañez Ortiz, and then in 1971, a work by Rafael Ferrer. So it really starts in the kind of 60s, 70s, and also programmatically, Rafael Ferrer is in a show in 69, Anti-Illusions, and then in 71, he has a solo show. So it's an interesting story. It starts there, but kind of in a fascinating way that I think it's also worth talking about in terms of the history and different beginnings, different origins of the institution's relationship with Latinx art. What happened in 71 is that there's a 20-year period between 71 and 1991 when zero Latinx artists are acquired. And I have different theories about that. Thomas Armstrong becomes the director in 74. And he had a very strict rule about artists had to be US citizens in order to be in the collection, and you had to be shown at the museum. You had to come through the program in order to be collected. So there were a couple of things, and I'm presuming perhaps, and you know, I don't have any evidence of this, but perhaps Latinx artists who had a surname that made them sound foreign perhaps weren't acquired. This is my own personal, I would have to do more research on this, but it's my theory. But then it gets renewed, this history in the mid 1970s with the acquisition of works by Ana Mendieta. Another, just to kind of conclude this, you know, the answer to your question, Carmen, it's really important, again, thinking about these different beginnings, that right before I started at the Whitney, which is going to be now 6 years ago, Rita Gonzalez, curator at LACMA, had done an assessment, a really valuable study of the Whitney's collection of Latinx art, right prior to moving to the new building in the Meatpacking District. And her assessment evaluation was really pivotal in my case and for my, you know, tenure here at the Whitney, because it became a blueprint of where we stood and where, you know, how to track progress. You know, I'm interested and invested in seeing how things are changing. And so I would be remiss not to mention Rita's incredible, you know, contribution to the history of the Whitney in that sense.
Great, thank you. Rodrigo?
Yes, so happy to be here in conversation with you today, and honored to be talking about El Museo's mission and history and how we are thinking also about the future of the institution that is so central, not to Latinx art history. So, I mean, the foundation of El Museo's, it's a fascinating history. It's a museum that comes from a completely different background than most art museums anywhere in the world. It's an artist-founded museum in 1969, aiming at a diasporic Puerto Rican representation and community education, right? So that's at the core of El Museo's history. Also a New York-centric museum, first and foremost, but also uptown-centric, you know, being born at the PS 206 at a public school, El Barrio-centric in East Harlem, in Spanish Harlem. So also Rafael Montañez Ortiz's perspective, an artistic vision for a museum, right? A museum that it's founded by an artist. So as part of that, I think there's an important consideration, even of almost like a critique to the whole idea of cultural specific museum, where he said, like, I understand the relationship between culture and this institution. So he's talking about museums and how they affirm certain cultural values and not others. And how they are founded by people who are speaking to the value, the richness, and the superiority of their culture. So I think he's putting his finger on something that is really like that every institution is culturally specific, or it speaks of a cultural experience. So also think about, you know, just to stay on the, you know, early history of El Museo a little bit more, also think about like the, you know, zoological field and culture from a like fresh, bold and decolonized perspective, right? So it's a museum that centers on anti-racist narratives right at the beginning, also on an integration of spheres such as crafts and spirituality, spheres that have been, you know, marginalized to say the least, or really excluded from museological narratives historically. And also amplifying the contribution of African and Amerindian cultures to the development of the hemisphere. So in other words, an anti-Eurocentric museum right at the start, and also a museum that sees culture and art as an instrument for self-determination. And it's really interesting how this has, you know, since right at the start created a dynamic of exhibitions that goes against some of the core values of the Western art museum, such as, you know, accumulation of wealth, to name one, or the exceptionality of the individual genius, you know, this idea of the artist in a pedestal or the masterwork. So these are all, you know, core values in the Western museum that the museum somehow right at the start goes against substituting these values by like grassroots activism and collective constructions, right? Also, the following directors like Marta Moreno Vega and Hiram Maristani implemented not only forward-thinking exhibitions, but also deepened the conceptual breadth of the museum. Just to quote Moreno Vega in her 1972 essay at Kimbamba, one of the journals the museum was then publishing, our people are therefore seeking real art experiences, which are not based on art as sorted wealth, but on art as a way of life. So I think that's that's a very ontological distinction, that it's the idea is finding a tangible existence in the community. And also there's a very rich history right at that beginning, that this way, which is talking about like the very first 5-6 years. But also there's like a sedimentation of other experiences following that, that, has bringing the museum to different, moments in its history. So the relocation to Fifth Avenue, I think it's a very important moment. But just before that, the range of exhibitions that the museum was creating then, from the art of needlework, which was the foundational show, to, very ambitious and strategic thinking shows like the Art Heritage of Puerto Rican, which was the first major show of Puerto Rican art in the United States, co-organized and co-hosted with the Met in '73. And then, more recently, over the last decades, also the museum has been an important point of contact of the Latino community with Latin American art in the United States, also very importantly, and at a very pioneer capacity too. Important artists who received attention from mainstream museums later on had their initial shows or their initial first historical revisions organized by El Museo, such as Carmen Herrera, to name one, or Beatriz Gonzalez, to name another. So it's a combination of different moments in the history of the museum that I think it makes it so unique and so critically positioned in the Latinx art realm and institutional landscape. So I mean, there's so much more, but I think we could develop some of these ideas in other questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, both of you, so much. You're highlighting these, in many ways, very different histories. And, Rodrigo, I just really liked the way that you kind of showcased the trailblazing nature of, Latinx arts institutions. I think, we forget and we don't really dig deeply into their history, right? And they've been extremely progressive institutions, and a lot of what museums are trying to do today, these institutions were doing when they were founded. So it's really important to have that, to draw that history out. I think, speaking for my own institution, the National Gallery, I think that we're really at the beginning of a journey with Latinx art. Before I became Chief Curatorial Officer, there was minimal activity and a lot what you might expect for a traditional large museum like the National Gallery. So 2 artists that were really important for the museum in terms of its acquisitions were Felix Gonzalez-Torres and Ana Mendieta, which are, kind of in many ways very exceptional figures that have been very much embraced by large mainstream institutions, if you want to use that term, and were, even during their lifetimes, kind of part of these histories and discourses of the art of the United States. So in many ways, embracing those artists is almost like expected, right? Maybe Ana Mendieta is slightly different, but but it's very much in keeping with sort of what you might expect of a large institution. And when I look at the history of the National Gallery, which I'm also still in the midst of studying, what I see lacking is historic artists, dating back to the 19th century, early 20th century, but also artists that were strongly linked with Latinx artistic circles and discourses, including figures with major reputations, like someone like Luis Jimenez, for instance. The collection started to be transformed when the Corcoran collection was transferred to the National Gallery, which really provided, I like to think of it as like an injection, of diverse artists and women artists. And in terms of Latinx art, the Corcoran collection was very important to transforming our photography and print collections with respect to Latinx representation. I think now we're at a very at a kind of a different inflection point, since establishing, our new mission after Feldman became our director, and prioritizing, reflecting, and attracting the nation. We have embarked on a kind of an intentional effort to be more inclusive, and we've begun to sort of chart a much more sort of fulsome approach and path to supporting Latinx art, sort of bringing and thinking about Latinx art and really all aspects of our activity, from our collections, exhibitions, scholarship, programs, mentorship activities. So it's really kind of just integrating it into everything that we do. And then right now, we're also excited that we received funding from the Getty Foundation as part of the Advancing Latinx Art and Museums initiative to establish our first curatorial position in Latinx art. So I think that will also be transformative for us. Great. So I wanted to get back to a little bit of my introduction, where I sort of painted this picture of this, what I'm calling this pivot point that we're at in terms of Latinx art in museums in the United States. And I wonder if, if you all, how would you characterize this current moment? Do you see it as a pivot point? How do you both see, the state of affairs right now? Do you have any concerns about what's happening today? So a lot of different questions. So Rodrigo, do you want to start?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first of all, I should say that I've not been working on this field for like long enough to have a full historical sense of the change in the landscape. However, I do have a few considerations about just the moment of now to share with you, and it would be good to exchange a little bit on the perception we all having of this moment. But I would say that I think that the main change that I've been perceiving since having joined the museum in 2019, and somehow being novel to this field, just 5 years working with Latinx artists and Latinx art history, is that I believe there's much more systematic support, or like the infrastructural investment, which I deem as really central. And you, of course, you touched on that on your opening remarks, Carmen, as well as even in your previous comments on your work at the National Gallery, where this certainly foundation support that is really game-changing in terms of distribution of support among from distribution of support among artists. I think I've been involved, the museum has been involved rather, and I've been part of the Latinx Artists Fellowship, and I really consider this program a really moment of division before and after, on how we like really seeing this successive years of awardees and recipients And that, I think, it's like such a strong testament just to the strength of this field, no? Of like, I mean, the variety of artists, you know, how, you know, widely distributed they are, you know, nationwide, and how much many of them have been, you know, lacking institutional recognition in, you know, different ways. So I think this is certainly very exciting and to be part of, and, you know, to, you know, be sharing this space with such, you know, great colleagues and doing amazing work in other institutions. You also mentioned the Getty funding for, you know, specific positions in, you know, Latinx-centric institutions such as ours, as well as in more generalistic encyclopedic institutions such as yours. And I think that's so important. No, it's like really this infrastructure investment. I think this is, you know, and I hope this is the beginning of a lot of more changes that will come with, you know, consequences for everybody, including small institutions, you know, at the, you know, collecting level. So I'll leave it like that. Maybe we can pick it up later on how we're impacting our own field with these changes. But I'm, you know, certainly on a very positive tone. Yeah.
Okay. Marcela, how do you see things?
Yeah, you know, I think there's always this fear that it's a moment. Moments are by nature transitory, and I think we all have, you know, some level of hesitancy when we talk about this, because we fear that it might go away. But I think when I have to talk about this, and I prefer to err on the side of optimism. I think we owe it to ourselves and to people who have come before us and to the field to have kind of a more optimist attitude about this. And I think that the prevailing values that I sense are about community networking, plurality, that we're accepting many voices, that it's not, you know, this is not about exclusive clubs or exclusivity or gatekeeping or competition. In fact, it's the opposite. I see us in occupying more spaces in the overall ecosystem of the arts. And that is what really makes me more of a glass half full kind of person, of seeing how, you know, I mean, curators, there's so many, and even just at the curatorial field, you know, if we just focus on that, I can see how, you know, the more exhibitions, the more scholarship there is, the more kind of, you know, a healthy competition in the sense that, oh, you're working with this artist, oh shoot, I can't, or not that I can't, but then I'm going to work with this other artist. And, you know, we're expanding the discourse. So that's just, you know, looking at curatorial, but then you see the work of USLAF on the Latinx project, and the more they're occupying these spaces also of academia, of asking academia to, you know, pay attention to education and to our history programs at the undergrad, but also doctoral levels. And then you see it, you mentioned foundations, galleries, you know, galleries that are focusing on Latinx are like Patricia Reese-Healy, Nicole Calderon, so many others. I feel like Proxico, but then other galleries who are taking Latinx artists. And, you know, there are other areas where, sure, there's a lot of growth that needs to be done. In our criticism, we love Max, and but he can be the only one. There's more than Max. But yeah, we need to keep that momentum going. So I see him less than a moment, but more as a momentum that needs to keep oscillating in the right direction. But I tend to be more hopeful, and I hope that's, you know, pervasive, that that optimism keeps going around the nation.
Yeah, I think both of you are, you know, are feeling optimistic. I'm also feeling optimistic. I do have a sense of caution and to some extent skepticism sometimes as well. And kind of like what I said before when, Rodrigo was talking about, the history of El Museo and all of that is, I want to make sure that the work of Latinx institutions is recognized for its leadership, for their leadership. And I think that, there are a lot of sort of players. There's the community of scholars, of curators, of artists and institutions, and the networking work that we're doing and the supportive work that we're doing with each other. And then there's like the media, right, and the art media that, often represents a very different picture, right? So I'm very just cautious about that and wanting the field to acknowledge, the importance of Latinx institutions who really have been nurturing and developing this field. And now we have this larger group of institutions that are interested in it, but then they're often getting more of the attention. So I'm concerned about that. And then
But
I think I'm
Carmen,
also, yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you. I'm very interested in that, in the sense that do you see a way to resolve that, knowing, that surely the answer is not for bigger, whatever that means, institutions to stop doing work. So I think I see it as really education. My newest thing is, let's talk about American art, courses in American art. You brought up and Rodrigo Carmen Herrera before. I learned about Carmen Herrera in working with Mari Carmen Ramirez at the MFAH. I didn't learn about her in my American art courses in Madison, Wisconsin. So what is the way to kind of go about this if it's not, for the bigger institutions to just stop looking at that and leaving, El Museo and others to do it?
Yeah, no, I'm not advocating for that. I think it's important to have Latinx art in as many places as possible. I think that is the reality of the field. I mean, artists contribute to many, many different discourses, and they need to be, we have to have Latinx artists at the Jewish Museum. We need to have Latinx artists at, the National Museum of, African American History and Culture. We need to be in all of these places. So I'm not advocating for this kind of exclusivity, but I think that it is important and incumbent upon us in the field to constantly make sure that in whatever we do, that we are inclusive of Latinx, institutions that have led the field. That's why, for example, when the National Gallery presented its first symposium on Latinx art, I made sure that, Susanna Temkin was presenting, right? It's important that we have a Latinx institution presented in that mix and contributing to those discourses. So it's really about our awareness and, finding those opportunities to collaborate, to work together, to affirm the broadness of the field and the many different actors and actresses that contribute to it.
Yeah, I mean, I like to contribute to this discussion a little bit by saying a couple of things. I would say that it's we need every museum. No, there's no doubt about this. So I think we all agree on that. And I will also add something to this, that is that Latinx art will have a different role in different museums, no, and will be perceived and will be, the art historical framework will be different in every institution. No? So I mean, having worked at MASP in São Paulo, I can tell you that, having an European collection in a third world country, with a very important African population, it's very different than having a European collection in one of the, cities of the empire. So I think, yes, we need Latinx art everywhere, but I think the level of investment, it's different. I think there's, when you were just describing, the infrastructure a large institution has is very different, than in a smaller museum. So I think this is this is why I would say it's very important, what you're saying, Carmen, it's like this ongoing support, this ongoing presence of the Latinx institutions, but also how, maybe this is a question. I mean, there's so many things to be done in the future, and I think this panel is really looking at this, questionings. I mean, I think it's really important to think of partnerships between larger institutions and smaller institutions. I mean, I keep insisting on that, co-ownership of works or, projects together, that the visibility of the larger institutions is being used in favor of smaller institutions. Because it's what we're all saying about Carmen is Herrera, in this case, it's right? It's easily forgotten, the institutional role that a smaller institution plays on that. In favor, and that's only expected because it's our history tends to concentrate power as every history and every. So I think this is. I mean, I'm just like echoing something you said before, Carmen Ramos, in this case, but. To agree that there should be more collaboration and there should be, specific foci on the Latinx institutions and their leading role again.
So why don't we shift the conversation into your current programs at your institutions? What are your future plans, your ongoing plans? To sort of steward Latinx art at your institutions. Marcela, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I want to frame that in a kind of more larger, more encompassing, I guess, context, in the sense that I think my role at the museum is no different to the role of other curators in my museum. In the sense that we're all interested and invested in thinking of art in the US as a prism, meaning, thinking of the US if it were this object with, sharp angles that, depending from the angle in which you see it, it will reveal like different colors, meaning different definitions of what American art is. So taking that, as a very simple kind of figure image, you can do that with Latinx art. So thinking about the different stories that could be told about Latinx art more broadly, and in a way, I think it's not that different to the work that other curators in my institution have done. If you think about, Chrissy Isles building a collection of film, someone who was standing on the shoulders of John Hanhart. So, or it's Elizabeth Sussman creating an incredible collection of photography. So I'm in a different way, I guess, but similarly at the same time doing the same with Latinx art. And I guess more concretely, Carmen, to your question, I see that my most immediate goals are a little bit like yours, like seeing, I know the gaps that are in the collection. I know the years, I know the people who were neglected from being in this institution at the periods and the times that they should have been brought into the collection and also into the program. So I'm attempting to address those gaps, and that means artists who are now deceased, or more senior artists, or even mid-career artists, and at the same time continuing our attention to emerging artists, which is something that the museum has always had, that it's kind of its signature. And then I guess kind of as a third role is bringing the whole institution into the same vision, into the same mission and goals regarding Latinx art. So it's not just at the program, at the curatorial level, but we're also thinking about, press, advancement, all the different departments working holistically toward the same goal. And, anecdotally, I think that from my first exhibition in 2018, to this one bigger one that I did, it's night and day, the difference in terms of the staff that is contributing, the idea, you know, we could get into the nitty gritty of that, but it's something that obviously cannot happen, as Rodrigo knows well, only in the curatorial departments or from the curatorial departments.
Marcela, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's just to make it a little more conversational for a second. This is something I was thinking this morning, you know, the difference, because you had like these two important shows that they somehow complement each other, but they have very different reception history as well. No? So if you could just comment on that a little bit. I know you mentioned it, but that would be also maybe illuminating to understand the pivot moment, as you know, Carmen has been describing it. Sorry, I've been just curious.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, you're absolutely right. It's been completely different. You know, in part it has to do with kind of the space, even in the museum, how much space I got. But I do want to give credit to all the people who contributed in making, you know, what No Existe has been. And we're talking about an education department led by Chris Gorza, a Mexican-American woman who was made sure before I had this more like visibility in terms of a full curator position. But she was the person at the table advocating for bilingual labels, for partnerships with Puerto Rican teachers in Puerto Rico and in the US, in New York, a whole roster of programs, of residencies with artists. It's as I said, a full roster, many initiatives coming from education. We have a new communications department that you know, made sure that they had contacts with the Spanish-speaking and Latinx press in New York City, also Puerto Rico, leveraging also, you know, contacts that I had there. A new digital team, also led by Latinx women. Just openness, real pure openness. You know, also kind of I have to give props to the director of public programs, Megan Hoyer, who when I did Pacha, she was very open to my ideas. And because public programs and education are departments that can absorb things and can react more quickly than say, oh, let's plan an exhibition 3 years from now, but they can act more quickly. They're a little bit more limber in that sense. From the beginning, our relationship has always been like, what ideas do you have? Okay, I think I have money in the budget. Let's do this. And with her, we did a first public program for Pacha. And during the pandemic, we did that series of book presentations. And that then led to, you know, 3 incredible virtual programs with basically all the artists of No Existe, and many other things, a poetry reading with 20 poets, curated by Raquel. So just that openness and familiarity also with me as a curator, but also with the topic and the people has made a huge difference, as you pointed out, Rodrigo.
There's one thing that I found it like really cool in your whole narrative is that, you know, the Latinx staff is it's such an important element, no, in for just institutional understanding of how to message this exhibition, I guess. So no, thanks for sharing that. I think it's illuminating for, you know, several colleagues in the field watching us today.
Rodrigo, do you want to talk about your
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wanted to, you know, just highly acknowledge all my colleagues, because I'm gonna, you know, talk myself here, but this is really a, you know, collective construction of the registers and the curators, especially Susanna Temkin, who's you mentioned before. So the construct, you know, our colleagues in the museum in the different departments, but I think we wanted to create a new exhibition, new exciting exhibition program for El Museo. I mentioned this a little bit before, you know, this if you believe just like geological eras of El Museo, no? So if you look at this, you know, different substracts. So it's really exciting when you're given this opportunity to think of a museum with, you know, such a diverse and such a unique history and such a progressive history, as the word you use, I think, is really to the point. So we brought forward different ideas for that. One that I, you know, just like a main task I take up for myself was to, you know, curate a series of shows, revisiting, re-examining, you know, historical revisions of this artistic-centric vision of El Museo. So through, you know, really acknowledging the participation of the artists in the creation of the museum, in the like this enunciation of a new model for a museum. So this shows, I mean, my debut show here was the Taller Boricua political print shop in New York. I mentioned this in our call. A lot of people say, but this is so obvious, you're, you know, curating Taller Boricua as your first show. You know, I don't know, people maybe they were expecting me to do like a mainstream Latin American artist, you know, given my, you know, just track record and work in different institutions. But I thought it was really important, you know, to put everybody, you know, our audiences, ourselves, in a very, you know, studying mode. So that show was actually the first show of Taller Boricua that the museum organized in several years, since '89. So it was like there was never really like a historical reconsideration of Taller Boricua. And that show was really focusing on their work in the '70s and their, you know, like really close ties with El Museo as almost like twin organizations of the New Yorican arts movement in New York. And then there was also the Enfoco, which I co-organized with Susanna, just like a one portfolio exhibition looking at, you know, community photography and, you know, really examining this paradigms of, you know, photography as a community too. I think you're also following the steps of your show here, Carmen, down this main streets, you know, photography being such a, as well as printmaking, right, as such a like core idiom of El Museo's aesthetic and you know, artistic commitment. So that you know, the Enfoco New York Puerto Rican experience portfolio from 1974 had never been shown before as a whole at El Museo, and never since the 70s shown at all, just like in small fractions. So that show was also very important in that trajectory. Rafael Montañez Ortiz show was the next one in the series. We're still working on a couple for the next few years. So those shows every now and then, they, you know, they bring in the, you know, the foundational ethos and help us, you know, to all look at that, but also bringing, you know, new scholarship. You know, the Rafael Montañez Ortiz was co-curated with Julieta Gonzalez, curator I admire, and was, you know, now working in Brazil, but was, you know, formerly in Mexico. And there was a contextual retrospective, which I think was, it's really important, you know, just to honor Rafael's vision and always, you know, like fighting for the community, but also making sure it's understood that he's a great artist, Latino or not, right? That's, I think, is so important to really understand his thinking. And being a contextual retrospective, that also gave us the opportunity to, you know, put his work in dialogue with non-Latino artists in a Latino institution, which I think is key. It's really key, you know, that we communicate to different art histories, that we create this this point of multiplicity and plurality from a Latino perspective, Latinx perspective, New York perspective, New Yorican perspective. So another important point in terms of exhibition program was the Triennale, right, that you mentioned in the intro, that has, you know, historically played a major role for, you know, different successive generations of artists and curators and researchers and, you know, and audiences in New York, but initially with a focus on New York-based artists. And, you know, for its first edition, together with Susanna and Elia Alba, the artist, we turned it into a nationwide survey of Latinx artists with works created in the 21st century, like really looking at, you know, the nationwide breadth of Latinx art and, you know, putting cities in between the coastal cities, importantly. So very research-driven show, but also, this idea of like showcasing the dynamism and the excitement in the field and the diversity in the field. Then there's also, I think there's also like, secondary foci that are also important to mention. I think I mentioned in passing how important it would be for an institution with a Latin American history, also as El Museo, to recreate narratives, to rethink ways of engaging with Latin American art. So we did a show called Popular Painters and Other Visionaries in 2021, highly collection focused, but with a lot of loans as well, looking at this, phenomenon of the so-called self-taught artists as a diasporic phenomenon in the modernity in the Americas, mid-century specifically, but looking at, different geography, across geographies and, Brazil, other South American countries, Mexico and the Caribbean and the United States. So this is, I think it's a way to think of modernism from a perspective of El Museo. It's a show that I think it contributes to, a moment where the museum was also doing a lot of ambitious historical exhibitions with Deb Cullen here, such as, Art Nexus New York, Arte Noise Vida. This more like survey, geography, cross geography exhibitions. It's just to name a few examples on how we're like dealing with exhibition program here. I don't know, maybe we can talk, another moment to talk about collection building, which I, find very important also. Yeah.
Absolutely. We're nearing the end of our program, but just, for me to contribute a little bit about what's going on at the National Gallery is, I've been really excited about joining the National Gallery after having, developed, a very robust program at the Smithsonian American Art Museum that sort of looked at Latinx art within the context of the art of the United States. And it was really very important to affirm that place of Latinx art within those narratives because they had been excluded for so long. So, simply affirming Latinx art is American art is like a major paradigm shift, in many ways, because it had been so excluded and kind of sort of seen in its own universe or associated with Latin American art, but also in a subordinate way. So I think a lot of my work at the Smithsonian was kind of like challenging that in a number of directions. And now I'm at an institution that has a very different mandate. It's close to encyclopedic institution known for its collections of European art, and I'm very motivated by that to think about Latinx art in an extremely expansive way, allowing Latinx art to sort of be the complex thing that it is, right? The ways in which it contributes to many different discourses, from, it's part of the history of the African diaspora. It's part of, it has ties to indigenism, notions of indigeneity, post-colonialism, feminism, Christianity. I mean, you could just go on and on. It's just connected with so many different discourses that are global discourses, that I think I feel really empowered, by being at this institution and kind of opening that up a bit more, opening up the ways in which we've historically thought of Latinx art, respecting its specificity, always, and grounding it in the specificity of what it is and the perspective of Latinx artists, but also understanding it within this sort of broader history of art, the history of art, of which it is undoubtedly a part. It's, a huge part of that. And it makes amazing and brings amazing perspectives and challenges and, redirecting our thinking, about some of these concepts that have been that are part of humanity, essentially. So that whole thing is just really inspiring to me and giving me a lot of energy these days. And also by this moment, where we're just about to welcome a new curator. So I'm not going to be the only one, right? Which is great because I agree with kind of what we're all saying, about the importance of multiple voices, and that there are different ways to do this work, So I really appreciate what Marcela is saying about, how her work is grounded within the institution and that there are many voices and many contributors to this work. So I think that that's also part of this pivot point, that we're at, that finally institutions are understanding that it's not just, okay, we're going to bring in this one person and everything is going to be on their shoulders, and it's impossible work. You're not able to do as much as you need to do. But now we're seeing that you need a much bigger infrastructure. So you need to have people with, Latinx expertise are focused to their responsibilities in pretty much every department of an institution. So that's really exciting. So we have just a few minutes, and I want us to start to end with really highlighting something that we're excited about. And in our previous conversations, we talked about the importance of acquisitions to transforming institutions. So I'm hoping that we could just, each of us, just talk about a recent acquisition that we're excited with. So we'll start with Rodrigo, and I welcome my colleagues at the New York Historical Society to start the PowerPoint.
This is so much fun. I love that part that we like little show and tell on collection. I mentioned this just in passing, the importance of keep collecting for an institution like El Museo. We don't have currently a permanent collection display at El Museo, but this is, it's a lot of people only know us for our, fantastic exhibition history and our fantastic exhibitions. But we actually, our next show, something beautiful, Reframing La Colección, open in May 18th, is going to be a year-long collection show with around 500 objects from the collection. And so we've been working, me and my colleagues, co-curators Susanna Temke and Liz Sessions, we've been working on a collection focus, really strongly. And so when we met, we talked about bring a new acquisition. So this was the piece we had just received then. It's a photograph by Luis Carla, a Puerto Rican photographer based in New York City. So we collaborated with Luis. This is one image, one picture from a larger lot of his photographs, new prints that are entering El Museos. And I mentioned this in passing, the importance of photography for El Museos collection, but also how much we are, both with our shows like Domestic Annex was a show recently also addressing this, how we're really trying to give it a strong profile for queer and trans artists in our programs. And Luis was I consider a big gap in our collection. So this is a wonderful photograph where we show, the Gay Pride Parade on Christopher Street in West Village, and this sunbather on the New York City rooftop. So this is my show and tell. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rodrigo. Marcela?
Yeah, I wanna echo that this is a really fun part. I mean, not that the rest wasn't fun, the rest was very anyway, informative. But yeah, so I kind of want to give a little bit of context, like always, and because also all of our museums probably differ in some way how we bring works into the collection. But basically, we bring works into the collection 4 times a year, meaning that the board of trustees ratifies acquisitions. I believe it's 3 or 4, I think it's 4 times a year. And in this last kind of batch of works that came in that were ratified in March, there were several Latinx artists, but like Teresita Fernandez, Candida Alvarez, artists who were already in the collection. But out of the 7 new artists that came, 3 of them were Latinx, and I'm showing one, Virginia Jaramillo, and this work on title from 1967. It's a marvelous work by Virginia that, as you can see from the credit line, it was a purchase from the Painting and Sculpture Committee, but also with funds from John Sobel. So meaning perhaps people can glean that, this is a work that perhaps we should have, not perhaps, we definitely should have acquired when, for example, Virginia had a show in 1970, or she was part of the biennial in 1972. And so we had many, many chances, and then now the prices are a little bit outside of our scope, so we needed extra help. But yeah, we're excited. She made it right the year when she moved to New York from LA, and she settled on Spring Street. And yeah, it anticipates her curvilinear period. So it's a really beautiful work that I'm so fortunate that we have, and looking forward to seeing it one of these days in the permanent collection permanent collection hang or exhibition at the museum. And Carmen, I'm looking forward to seeing what you're gonna show, and I feel so bad for you that you made all these incredible acquisitions for the Smithsonian that you can't bring with you to the.
I know.
Right?
Yeah,
that's unfair. You should be able to.
We're working on building our collection, and I'm really excited that at the National Gallery, since I'm the chief curator and not the curator of Latinx art, that I've been working with curators across departments, and there's been so much support across the National Gallery, and curators have been pursuing works by Latinx artists. Just since I've arrived, we've acquired works by Daniel Ramos, Cristina Fernandez, Carmen Herrera, Martin Gutierrez, and Freddie Rodriguez, who's an artist that, as many people know, is very near and dear to my heart. And if just one message, if I could send one message to institutions that are listening to this who are interested in Latinx art, acquiring works by Latinx artists is one of the most important things that you can do to transform the work of your institution. It makes their work visible, it changes the way that we think about art history, it instigates research, and it preserves the work of Latinx artists for future generations. So it's really super important. And this is a work from a larger series that Freddie Rodriguez did about the Trujillo regime. And many of you may know Freddie Rodriguez. I often refer to him as the Dean of Dominican American Artists in the United States, who sadly passed away last year. He is one of the most important Latinx abstractionists in the history of art. And this work, as I said, comes from a series on the Trujillo regime, and which he initiated during the US invasion of Panama, which is really interesting because he is kind of interrogating a number of histories, obviously Dominican history, the impact of the Trujillo era on the diaspora, right? It kind of led to that impetus of the first waves of migration to the United States. But it also sort of inserts him in this larger discourse of art during the Cold War, during US interventions in Central America, which he's sort of like relating to this period of politics in the Caribbean. So this is the first work to enter the National Gallery's collection that contributes to that sort of moment when many American artists were interrogating politics in Central America. So I'm really excited that he is the first Latinx artist to be part of this larger sort of discourse that includes artists like Susan Meiselas, for example, that is in our collection. So it speaks a little bit to kind of our approach moving forward, is to, again, acknowledge that specificity, but also to think about artists in a larger sphere of art history. So I want to thank both of you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas with our audiences. I wish we had another hour because there are many other questions that I would love to ask. So maybe we'll have to find a way to do a part 2 of this conversation. I also want to thank the Luce Foundation for supporting this series and supporting this look at Latinx art. And thank you to our audiences for tuning in. Have a great afternoon.